Well, it was garbage day in the presidential campaign with garbage man Donald Trump actually climbing, I should say, stumbling into a garbage truck to stupidly draw attention to the free-flowing racism and bigotry at his Madison Square Garden rally on Sunday, which included a comedian no one has ever heard of referring to Puerto Rico and Puerto Ricans as, quote, a floating island of garbage. Last night, President Biden said this.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of seen as unconscionable, and it's un-American. It's totally contrary to everything we've done, everything we've been.
The Trump campaign immediately and falsely interpreted that statement to mean that Joe Biden was calling all of Donald Trump's supporters garbage. The White House released their transcript of the Biden statement, which you just saw, which shows President Biden was referring to one person and what one person said. When the president said, the only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters, meaning the garbage of one of Trump's supporters that was spewed into that microphone at Madison Square Garden. Joe Biden did not call that comedian, who no one's ever heard of, garbage. Joe Biden didn't call a person garbage, not even one person. He referred to that person's speech as garbage. Joe Biden had nothing to apologize for, and he didn't. To further clarify the point, President Biden issued a written statement. Earlier today, I referred to the hateful rhetoric about Puerto Rico spewed by Trump's supporter at his Madison Square Garden rally as garbage, which is the only word I can think of to describe it. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable. That's all I meant to say. The comments at that rally don't reflect who we are as a nation. Today, Vice President Harris said this.
Well, first of all, I think that the president has explained what he meant, but I've said it earlier. I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for. And that, I've made that clear throughout my career, including my speech last night before I think this all happened, which is I intend to be a president for all Americans, and including those who may not vote for me in this election. I take very seriously my obligation and my oath to concern myself first with the needs of the American people and put them before whatever might be my selfish issues.
Here's something that Donald Trump has never said. I strongly disagree with any criticism of people based on who they vote for. What you just heard the vice president say. Here's something else Donald Trump has never said. I intend to be president for all Americans, and including those who may not vote for me in this election. When Donald Trump has said something racist publicly, he has never once put out a statement to clarify exactly what he meant or that he meant something different. And yes, Donald Trump himself, of course, calls Americans garbage all the time.
And it's not her, it's the people that surround her. They're scum, and they want to take down our country. They are absolute garbage.
Scum. Garbage. There were 75,000 people surrounding Kamala Harris last night in Washington in a crowd that was 50% bigger than the last crowd Donald Trump spoke to in Washington on January 6th, 2021. Did Donald Trump mean that those 75,000 people who surrounded Kamala Harris last night, all of them are scum, are garbage? Is that what he meant? Did Donald Trump mean that everyone who voted for Kamala Harris to be our vice president 4 years ago is garbage? That's 80 million people. Or did Donald Trump mean the Harris campaign staff? That's hundreds of people. Or the vice president's White House staff, dozens of people. Or maybe the vice president's family? Did he mean her husband, Doug Emhoff, who will join us as a guest on this program tomorrow night? Donald Trump has never apologized for saying they are absolute garbage. Donald Trump has never clarified exactly who he was talking about when he said they are absolute garbage. His words were, the people that surround her, they are scum and they want to take our country down. They are absolute garbage. Donald Trump's words. Not one reporter ever asked Donald Trump about that statement, not one. The day Donald Trump called Kamala Harris supporters garbage, no one wrote a headline about that. It wasn't a news story. The poisonous American candidate for president who uses Hitler's language constantly and calls Democrats garbage, that was not news. But the very same news media that ignored all the times Donald Trump has called American citizens and American voters scum and garbage actually tried to turn Joe Biden's use of the word garbage into a controversial news story today. And to do so, they had to refuse to listen to the actual sentence Joe Biden spoke. They had to refuse to look at the written words of that sentence. They had to refuse to understand English grammar. They had to refuse to understand what a singular possessive is. They had to refuse to understand what apostrophe S means. They had to refuse to remember what they learned in elementary school about the English language. And they can do that because this campaign is being covered by some of the best reporters I've ever seen and by some of the worst reporters I've ever seen. And the worst of them actually tried to create a controversy today and tried to equate what President Biden said last night to what the man he was condemning said in Madison Square Garden. And those reporters know that that is false. But it is the kind of false narrative that panicked, stupid campaign coverage exists to amplify. Not one of the reporters who got excited about this today asked Donald Trump to name the good things that Adolf Hitler did after Donald Trump was quoted by his White House Chief of Staff, John Kelly, saying, quote, Hitler did some good things. The terrible campaign reporters and commentators who are covering this campaign, it's not all of them, just the terrible ones, are completely exploitable by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump knows it, which is why Donald Trump, the stupidest candidate ever to run for president, climbed into a garbage truck today to try to draw more attention to what President Biden said last night, which Donald Trump stupidly does not understand requires drawing more attention to what he and his vile speakers had to say at Madison Square Garden on Sunday, an event that has already cost Donald Trump the retracted endorsement by a prominent Puerto Rican entertainer. Today in North Carolina, Kamala Harris said this.
Unlike Donald Trump, I don't believe people who disagree with me are the enemy. He wants to put them in jail. I'll give them a seat at the table. And I pledge to be a president for all Americans and to always put country above party and self.
Donald Trump, the candidate who has called everyone in the country who doesn't support him, half the country, the enemy within. The enemy within. That same Donald Trump has never said that he will give people who disagree with him a seat at the table. He has never said he will listen to them in any way, ever, under any circumstances. The enemy within candidate who has repeatedly called Americans garbage tried to spend the day today complaining about Joe Biden using the word garbage correctly to describe what was said at Donald Trump's campaign rally. And Donald Trump was actually able to get some people covering this campaign to fall for it and to cover what Joe Biden did not say. Much of the political news media has consistently failed you with coverage like that and can be relied on to continue to fail you with that kind of coverage right up to Election Day. Today's CNN poll shows a tie in Pennsylvania, 48-48. And in Michigan, Kamala Harris is at 48 to Donald Trump's 43. And in Wisconsin, Kamala Harris is at 51 to Donald Trump's 45. The so-called gold standard poll of Wisconsin, the Marquette University Law School poll, shows a tighter race in that state with Kamala Harris at 50 and Donald Trump at 49. Bodybuilder turned movie star turned Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger endorsed Kamala Harris today, saying, "I will always be an American before I am a Republican." Schwarzenegger attacked Donald Trump as a leader, quote, "who will send his followers to attack the Capitol while he watches with a Diet Coke," end quote. Puerto Rico's largest newspaper, El Nuevo Dia, endorsed Kamala Harris today, saying Trump suffers from psychopathic elements that he evidences by lying repeatedly. Today, in an editorial titled "Donald Trump's Cognitive Decline Becoming a Troubling Concern," the Las Vegas Sun writes, "Donald Trump's racism, sexism, xenophobia, and penchant for corruption have long made him unfit for any public office, let alone the presidency. But as he continues his bid for a second term in the White House, there is an unsettling and undeniable shift that is leading many experts, observers, and even some Trump supporters to conclude that the former president's mental acuity and sharpness are also in decline, that his physical health and stamina are waning, and that his frustration and anger are boiling over. He shambles about aimlessly, slurs his words, and sometimes speaks gibberish." Today in Wisconsin, the garbage man said this.
My response to Joe and Kamala is very simple. You can't lead America if you don't love Americans. It's true.
Don't love Americans. So I guess the garbage man will never call Americans garbage again, which he's done. The garbage man will never call most Americans the enemy within. No presidential candidate has ever publicly expressed more hatred for more Americans than Donald Trump. And no American president has ever publicly expressed more hatred for the people who worked for him in the White House. That feeling is mutual, of course, since many of the members of Donald Trump's cabinet and high-ranking White House staff are publicly opposing his candidacy now and consider him a danger to the nation in the world, including his Vice President, Mike Pence. The garbage man candidate complained that Kamala Harris called him Hitler. In fact, the only candidate in the presidential campaign this year who has ever called Donald Trump Hitler is Donald Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, who compared Donald Trump to Hitler before J.D. Vance's miraculous conversion to a Trump running mate as comfortable with lying as Donald Trump. The new American way of death continues in Texas. ProPublica reports today on another death in a Texas hospital where a woman was refused the life-saving treatment she needed because of Donald Trump and the Trump justices on the Supreme Court and the Republican men who control Texas government, including, of course, Republican Senator Cruz, who Democrat Colin Allred is now running in a statistical tie with in that Senate campaign in Texas. Josely Barnica had a miscarriage at 17 weeks of pregnancy. She had been dreaming of delivering a sibling for her daughter. With the fetus partially emerged, the proper medical procedure would be removal and clearing the uterus to prevent a deadly sepsis infection. Texas doctors did nothing. ProPublica reports for 40 hours, the anguished 28-year-old mother prayed for doctors to help her get home to her daughter. All the while, her uterus remained exposed to bacteria. Barnica died of an infection. Donald Trump did that. Senator Cruz did that. The Republican justices on the Supreme Court did that. The men controlling the Texas government did that. Moments ago in Madison, Wisconsin, Vice President Harris said this.
Ours is a fight for the future, and it is a fight for freedom. Freedom. Like the fundamental freedom of a woman to make decisions about her own body and not have her government tell her what to do. And we all remember how we got here. When Donald Trump was president, he hand-selected 3 members of the United States Supreme Court with the intention that they would undo the protections of Roe v. Wade. They did as he intended, and now in America, 1 in 3 women lives in a state with a Trump abortion ban, many with no exceptions even for rape and incest, which is immoral. Immoral. And look, Donald Trump's not done. He would ban abortion nationwide. Yes, even here in Wisconsin. And he would restrict access to birth control, put IVF treatments at risk, and force states, listen to this, force states to monitor women's pregnancies. Just Google Project 2025. Read the plans yourself, and I know we all here know one does not have to abandon their faith or deeply held beliefs to agree. The government shouldn't be telling her what to do with her body. Not the government. Not the government. Not the government. And when Congress, together with Tammy's help, when Congress passes a bill to restore reproductive freedom nationwide, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law. Here is my pledge to you. As President, I pledge to seek common ground and common sense solutions to the challenges you face. I am not looking to score political points. I am looking to make progress, and I pledge I know we can make progress. And I pledge then to listen to experts, to those who will be impacted by the decisions I make, and to people who disagree with me. Because look, unlike Donald Trump, I don't believe people who disagree with me are the enemy. He wants to put them in jail. I'll give them a seat at my table. And I pledge to always put country above party and self, and to be a president for all Americans.